Okay. All right. So yeah, thanks everyone for coming. Thanks everyone for attending online. So it's our pleasure to have Duarte present in this week's seminar. So Duarte is kind of an EBD veteran, I guess. He started off doing his master's here, actually. He stayed on to do his PhD in Jordi Figuerola's group. I met him when he was postdocing here, but then he left, so he went to Germany, where he spent 4.5 years at the IDIV in Leipzig. And we're really excited to have him back. So he's been back since summer, or?
Yeah, July last year.
Since July, he came on as part of the SUMHAL project, but he's now received a Juan de la Cierva incorporación, and he'll start soon in collaboration with Miguel Clavero. So yeah, Duarte, thanks so much. We'll wait for these people to come in, and take it away when you're ready.
Thanks, Christoph. So yeah, as some of you know, I did my PhD thesis with Jordi, and with topics more related to seed dispersal and community ecology. But today I think I will put my biogeographer hat and we'll speak about birds and climate. So climate. As we all know, climate is a key driver of biodiversity across scales and across diverse levels of biological organization and different biodiversity metrics. So at the local scale, at the population level, it determines the performance of populations and species. For example, the thermal performance curve, as you all know, individuals respond to temperature, and they have an optimum temperature where their fitness is maximized, and then as temperatures go down or increase a lot, their performance goes down. It's also an important driver of species distributions. Species distributions are tightly related to climatic variation. Species distribution models are always, or not always, but one of the most important drivers of species distributions is climate. And then it's also related to community composition, because different species have different climatic niches. And by having these different climatic niches, species are distributed across the environmental gradients according to this climatic variation. And then, of course, climate is also very important for or in driving diversity gradients and differences among biomes. For example, the latitudinal gradient of diversity is very known and is tightly linked to climatic variation. At least it does not explain the diversity gradient, but it's correlated at least to the diversity gradient because of energy and metabolic rates, all this theory behind it. And because climate is such an important biodiversity driver, when climate changes, biodiversity is also supposed to change. That's widely accepted. Threats and changes are widespread across Earth. There are geographical differences in the threat levels, and which poses different conservation issues. But yeah, climate is changing, and that's affecting biodiversity. But we all know this, but it would be good to know how important is climate in the first place. So how climate is determining abundances and the distributions of organisms, populations, and species. In this meta-analysis by Weber in 2017, they gathered a bunch of studies with different species, and they saw that when you apply this, when you see what's the influence of various environmental variables, so either niche or a bunch of other environmental variables. And so if you have here the correlation between the abundance, and the suitability of the environmental driver. So the higher the correlation between climate and the abundance, the more important climate is. And they saw that if you do this with just climate, correlations are on average at 30%, whereas if you include other drivers of abundance and distributions, called the broad environmental niche, you can explain much more variation. And so there are two important messages here. So the first one is that climate is just one driver among many other important drivers. So it's not all. Species distribution should contemplate other drivers other than climate. And there's lots of variability in the explanatory or predictive ability of climate. So the importance of climate really varies among taxa. And so this is kind of what I will speak about today. And I defined the importance of climate as a driver and termed it climate matching. So it's really the degree to which the abundances or the probability of occurrence of these species match climatic variation. Or another way of saying is kind of the R-square of the relationship between a given climate variable or climatic space and the abundance or probability of occurrence. So you can imagine that if this model explains all the variation, so there's a perfect match between climate and abundance or distribution, so species are perfectly matched to climate, right? And then as you increase noise around the model, if it's explained by other variables or if it's some kind of stochastic process, whatever, so this climate matching starts to go down. And so here, there's some variation around the model, so the R-square is lower, and here it's even slower. So this is kind of a convenient way of defining climate matching or the importance of climate to predict or explain abundances or occurrences. And so I explored this at different levels. And so this will be the talk outline. So I explored whether the magnitude of climate matching or how the magnitude of climate matching, so the R-square of this relationship, varies among populations of the same species. For example, we can have different drivers and the importance of climate can be more important in some populations than others within the same species. Whether there's variation in climate matching among species, depending on their ecological traits, and if this climate matching, the importance of climate, varies through time. For example, in response to climate change, climate is changing, and maybe this climate matching is also being affected if species, for example, cannot track their preferred climates. So case study one, is there variation among populations in climate matching? And for this, I will use this study published by us in 2020. It was a project, or it is a project led by Laura Gangos. Many of you know her. She worked here for many years. She's now in Madrid in Complutense. And yeah, I will talk about this. It's a project in the Canary Islands. It's a long-term project monitoring the populations of these species here, the Norris falcon. So the distribution of these species, or the breeding distribution of these species, so this is the distribution of the breeding colonies, is mainly Mediterranean. It's spread around the Mediterranean basin and mostly in islands across the Mediterranean. And why is this curious breeding distribution? That's because the trophic resource of these species is birds during the breeding season. So the Norris falcon feeds on migratory birds, And so their breeding colonies are strategically placed across the Mediterranean to intersect these main migratory courses of these mainly songbirds, not only songbirds, but mainly songbirds. And so the distribution of these breeding colonies is not tightly associated to climate, but it has most to do with the distribution of migratory birds throughout the Mediterranean basin. And so why is this? That's because if you're on an island and you can easily reach the sea, you can easily catch these migratory birds, because if you are on the sea, they don't have anywhere to hide. And so it's easier for them to catch them, even because on winter, this is kind of a curiosity, the Leonora's falcon goes back to Madagascar, where they feed on insects. So they switch their trophic resource. And so they are not born to catch birds, but they just take advantage of this resource. And so many of you might have noticed that there's a different colony here, which is this one. So there's a breeding colony in the Canary Islands. And the Canary Islands are not part of these migratory flyways of songbirds. So what is this colony doing here? And so we went on to investigate it as part of this long-term project. So it's a breeding colony that is mostly situated in the archipelago Chinijo, which is here north of the Lanzarote Islands. It's a set of 3 small islands that harbor the whole population of the Leonora's falcon in the Canary Islands. And it's a long-term project where we monitor the Canarian population and carry out lots of other eco-evolutionary investigations. And as you can see, it's quite distant from Africa, and it's not part of the main migratory routes from Europe to Africa. And so what do they eat during the breeding season? That's what we asked. And so here you can already hint about something, because you see lots of feathers distributed around here. And so it's true that they also feed mostly on migratory birds. But how do they catch migratory birds if the Canary Islands are not part of this flyway and are quite far from the African coast? And so we kind of, being there doing field work, we kind of noticed that this is or could be related to the wind patterns in the Canary Islands. So during the summer, which is this upper panel here, the high pressures of the Azores make these trade winds in this direction. So easterly winds that blow from, inside Europe and Africa towards the American continent. And so this could be somehow dragging birds towards the Canary Islands. And so that was actually our working hypothesis, that this broad environmental force, which is this high pressure in the Azores, and the trade winds associated with it, could be influencing the amount of prey and the amount of, or the food availability in the Canary Islands. So we hypothesized that during the breeding season, easterly winds prevail. Easterly winds prevail, and when there's in years when there's more food availability, when easterly winds are more abundant, the productivity of the Leonora falcon would go up. And in years or when the easterly winds are not so intense, or kind of there's changes in this wind pattern, the productivity would be lower. On average, you can see that easterly winds, kind of depicted here in green colors, are more intense in this area around Essaouira, which is, so if you imagine that birds are migrating from south of Portugal and Spain towards Africa, if they take this direction and they reach here, and if the wind is strong, they can be dragged towards the Canary Islands. So it kind of matches our expectations. And so, yeah, hypothesis, easterly winds kind of push off migratory birds off the coast towards the Canary Islands. These increase the prey availability in the Canary Islands, and so the productivity and the number of offspring increases. And so we did this, we first simulated the trajectories of these migratory birds towards the Canary Islands. And so this is a mechanistic model where winds is the protagonist. So if there's, so the routes of the migrating birds is influenced by the intensity of the easterly winds. So if wind is blowing strongly from the east, then birds are dragged and their migratory routes kind of cross the Canary Islands. On the contrary, if winds are blowing from other directions, they can easily reach the African coast and their migratory routes do not kind of intersect the Canary Islands here. And so we would expect that if birds are arriving more regularly to the Canary Islands, falcons would be hunting closer to the Canary Islands. They don't need to move long distance to go and catch these migratory birds. And that's actually what we saw. So if the wind is blowing from east directions, they have to move lower distances than when the wind is blowing from western directions. And so we did this because we put GPS trackers on some birds, and we were able to see that in days when eastern winds are intense, they just move around the island, 10 kilometers, 15 kilometers at maximum. But when the wind is bad, so it's blowing from the west, they have to go sometimes to the African coast to get some food and feed their youngs. And so, of course, this had an effect on the productivity. So we clearly saw that when winds are blowing from eastern directions or in years, so this is the correlation among years, if the mean intensity of the easterly winds is higher, then the productivity of the Illinois falcon is higher, and as it goes down, the productivity goes down, and this could explain up to 86% of the variation in productivity across years, which is quite amazing. So we did this from various perspectives, mean easterly winds. If the number of prey increases with the easterly wind, the productivity goes up, and the best predictor was what we call the food gap, which is the number of consecutive days with lack of easterly winds. So if winds are really bad for the Illinois falcon across a long series of consecutive days, there's a food gap, and so the productivity was really associated to this, to the amount of consecutive days without food. And so, yeah, for this population, climates, wind patterns were really important, but not so much for the distribution of the whole species, which is across the Mediterranean, and migratory birds do not depend that much on these winds across the Mediterranean basin. And so some conclusions for this first part. At the species scale, the distribution does not match climatic variation, at least not so strongly as in this Canarian population. But the abundance of this edge population, because it's really on the edge of the distribution, the Canary Islands, depends tightly on climate. and that climate drivers are there, then temperature and precipitation, which are the usual suspects, are not the whole story. So there are other climatic variables that are widely overlooked, such as wind, that can be really important for the distribution of species and performance of populations. So for marine birds, it's also a good or an important driver. So moving on to case study 2. So is there variation in climate matching among species depending on their traits? We published this recently in GEB. If you want to have a look at it. This was in collaboration with John Chase at IDIV during my postdoc there in Germany. And so we investigated this, and now the methods were a bit different. So in order to estimate climate matching, which was the first stage, so this was a two-stage procedure. First, we estimated climate matching, and then we saw how climate matching was affected by species traits. In this first stage, we use species data from the North American Breeding Survey, BBS. This is a long-term big citizen science project starting in the 60s, I think, 67 or so. I used only from 83 because the climate data was much better from this date onwards. And so you can see that there's really lots of survey points across North America, in this case just USA. There's also some in Canada, but these were really close to the border, and climate data was not so fine scale for Canada, so we just used United States for this study. And so we estimated species climate models using boosted regression trees or GAMs, because we didn't want to just focus on linear relationship, but really any kind of relationship between climate and abundance or occurrence would be expected, and so we wanted to take that into account. We divided the data set into training data where we fitted the models, and then tested the model predictions on testing data, and so then we calculated the predictive performance of the models and defined that as climate matching. So the better the predictive ability of climate, the higher the climate matching was. And we did this by moving these bubbles around to have different training and testing sets, and climate matching was the mean of this predictive performance across the folds of the cross-validation procedure. We did this for 238 species of birds. And then in the second stage, we modeled this climate matching, so the which was the Spearman squared correlation of the predicted versus observed observations, and modeled it as a function of traits, having a random effect for year and also controlling for the phylogeny of the birds. So we had also not only intercepts of the relationship, but we allowed also the slopes of the relationship to vary with year. I can already tell you that there was not much variation among years, at least in the relationship between traits and climate matching. And we used Bayesian multi-level models, not because I'm a big fan of Bayesian statistics, but because it was just a more flexible way of doing this, because so the R-squared, the climate matching metric, varies between 0 and 1, and it's kind of a proportion of explained variation. And to accommodate this kind of beta distribution and controlling for phylogeny across different levels of random variation, it was kind of almost the only possibility I had to model all these in the same framework. I did this in the BR-MSR package. It's really a nice package if you want to check it. Anyway, climate matching as a function of traits and controlling for variation among years and the phylogeny. And what traits did I use? So we used, we tried to choose traits that are somehow linked to ecological theory. So many of you might know about this BUM diagram. So species distributions are determined by abiotic factors. So species respond to the environment, climate, topography, physical-chemical variables, whatever. To the biotic component, so species interaction, species competition, facilitation, whatever biotic component you can think of. And also dispersal, depicted here by M, which is migration, not migration of bird migration, seasonal migration, but migration of species to track their niches. And so the realized distribution is somewhere around here. So it's the joint effect of the abiotic, biotic, and dispersal mechanisms that influence the distribution of species. And so species can respond directly to climate, for example, their physiological tolerance and thermoregulatory capacity are affected by their body size. So I used body size as the usual suspect in all these species trait studies. Species can respond also to climate-dependent resources, for example, diet. Primary productivity is associated to climate, and so if species follow resources that are themselves driven by climate, so they can be indirectly affected by climate. The responsiveness to climate-independent resources, so they can be responding to other habitat characteristics that are not connected to climate. So, for example, if they have some kind of habitat or diet that do not depend directly on climate. And they can also have some kind of, or they can compete with other species that also prevents the species from tracking their preferred climates. If they are dispersal limited, they also cannot track their preferred climates, and so non-migratory species might be more limited by dispersal, for example. And there's another proxy for dispersal ability, which is this hand-wing index. This is a recent paper that shows this correlation between the hand-wing index, which is a measure of the wing in proportion to the body size, and so they saw that dispersal ability, so the distance at which they disperse during the first years, is really correlated to this hand-wing index. And also, the demography can also affect the extent to which species respond to climate, because if you're really abundant, it's easier for you to fill your climatic niche than if you're, have small population sizes that are more affected by stochastic processes, and there are local extinctions, and so the distributions can kind of be more decoupled from climate because of demographic aspects. And then the conservation status of the species. So this is kind of related to the demography, and if your trends are negative and there are population declines and species is suffering, they can also have more difficulty to track their climatic niches. So we saw that the phylogeny somehow affected, or that climate matching was related to the phylogeny. Phylogenetic relatedness was, or the phylogenetic signal was significant, but it was not that strong. So only 8% of the variation was explained by phylogenetic relatedness. There are some patterns. It's not easy to interpret, but you can see that. So if you look at the base of the tree, which starts here, and you read it clockwise, you can see that base families and more basal species tend to have lower climate matching than other species, and then higher climate matchings are kind of spread across the phylogeny. You can see that cardinals, for example, have high climate matchings, some mimids, but it's difficult to tell. So some signal, but hard to interpret, actually. Traits did explain more variation. Traits explained 56% of the variation. And so we saw a clear relationship between body mass and the strength of climate matching, or the magnitude of climate matching. It was this hump-shaped relationship. It's not easy to interpret, but it kind of matches metabolic expectations. If you think that bigger birds can more easily thermoregulate, and so they do not depend that much on differences in temperature, for example. So we would expect that for bigger birds, climate matching would be lower. They are also sometimes less able to, or not so good dispersers there as other species, because your body size in birds might influence the ability for you to fly. And for smaller species, it might be a different story. So this was mainly driven by hummingbirds, actually, and hummingbirds have this, ecological idiosyncrasy. They have this really specific habitat and feeding requirements that might not be as dependent on climate as other resources. And so that might kind of lead to this hump-shaped relationship, though it's difficult to interpret. Both the hand-wind index and migratory status, so these proxies for dispersal ability, were not significant. And it kind of makes sense because birds are, able to fly, and so they easily disperse from one place to another. So it makes sense that dispersal ability is not so related to climate matching. Climate matching was lower in open habitats, and that might be due to how these open habitats are distributed across the continent. For example, forests are more tightly related to precipitation gradients and temperature, whereas open habitats can be more spread around the continent without so much connection to climates, also because of habitat fragmentation and all these stories. So it also makes sense that species living or preferring open habitats are less well matched to climate than species living in more dense or semi-dense habitats like forests and shrubland. And then one of the strongest predictors was habitat specialization. So the more specialized species were in a given habitat, the lower their climate matching was. And that makes sense because if you're seeking for a very specific habitat, then you cannot track your climate optimum that easily, because you're looking for other resources other than climate. So it makes sense that there's a negative relationship. We also found some relation with diets. So this is there was many diet axes. We reduced that using PCA. And so this axis reflects a preference for seeds here towards vertebrates on the other extreme. And we found a positive relationship. It's not really strong, and it's lots of noise around it, but yeah, a certain preference or a certain tendency for species feeding on invertebrates to have higher climate matching. Concerning the competition or the biotic aspect of the niche. So we did this with territoriality, and we found that non-territorial species were less well matched to climate than territorial species. And it makes sense because if you can outcompete other species, so if you're a strong competitor, you can keep your preferred habitats and kind of displace subordinate species or species that are not territorial to more peripheral or suboptimal habitats. So from an ecological perspective, it also makes sense that territorial species are more matched to their preferred climates than the others. And then there was also a strong relationship between demographic parameters like abundance and the variability in abundance between sites. The more abundant species were, the more they could kind of fill in their climatic niche. So climate matching went up as the abundance also increased. And lastly, for the variability in abundance depicted by the coefficient of variation, we saw this hump shape, but it was really, so this was really a few species that did this first increase here, a few very rare species, but the dominant pattern was kind of a negative relationship. So the higher the variability in abundance, the less well matched to climate species were. Sorry. Just to give some examples of species, so I did a PCA where I reduced all these trait dimensions to a binary space, and so you can see kind of that there's a trade-off between all these traits between abundance, territoriality, competitive ability, diet, habitat specialization, and abundance variation. And so, for example, the northern cardinal, which was the species with higher climate matching, so the species that was influenced more strongly by climate, is a highly territorial species, a very abundant species, and so this species can kind of easily fill its climatic niche and respond to climatic variation very well. Other species, so for example, the gray-tailed grackle. This is a different case. This species kind of is still spreading across USA because it used to live only in Mexico, and since the 40s, I think, it's been growing and extending through USA. And so it's normal that when you're kind of expanding your distribution, so you're not in equilibrium with your climatic niche. And so that is why the climate matching is quite low here. And as you can see, the abundance variability of this species is huge because in some places you're very abundant, you're already there, but when you're colonizing other places, you start with low numbers of individuals. So there's this huge variation in abundance that is creating this pattern of decoupling with climates. And then this one is also territorial. It's not very specialized in habitat, but it's sufficient to have a high climate matching. And finally, the Cordilleran flycatcher, which is an habitat specialist species and lives in this kind of rocky mountains, and is not well matched to climate because it mainly seeks for their preferred habitat and not so much for climate variability or climate dependent resources.
Mind you raise your voice a little bit more?
Oh, okay, I will try, sorry. And lastly, so I was expecting, based on the abundance relationships, that species of least concern would have higher climate matching indices, because if you're quite abundant, you can fill in your niche better than other species. But I saw that near threatened species, so species that are kind of declining but are not really yet affected by, or the conservation is not yet of higher concern, has really a higher climate matching. And this might make sense if you think that if climate is an important driver for the species, and if climate is changing, then those species that are more affected by climate will be most threatened because of climate change. So, and this would match this expectation. Whereas vulnerable species that are kind of really declining, their population sizes and abundances are really going down, and so they're having troubles to keep up with climate change and the global changes, and so their score is lower than the other less threatened species. So it might make sense, though it's really difficult to make some kind of interpretation here. But yeah, so there's high variation in climate matching among bird species. So from 0 species that are not responsive to climate at all to up to 70%. And species traits underlie this climate matching. So these species traits could explain up to 66% of the variation in climate matching. And habitat specialization and demography were especially explained more variation than other traits. And so the third, oh, it's already quite late, so I have to rush. So is there variation through time? This is, if you think that climate is changing and species are also suffering from other global changes, their distributions could be or becoming more decoupled from climate as it changes. And so we tested that and also tried to seek some mechanism behind it. So we explored whether differential rates of climate and land use change among the species ranges could be the cause of these trends in climate matching, or if it could be species traits, or if demographic trends, if species are declining or doing well, could be also related to temporal trends in climate matching. Oh, sorry. So we did the same procedure as the study before, but now instead of species traits directly, we modeled the climate matching, so the predictive ability of climate, as a function of time during a 30-year period, using a smaller set of sites, the ones that were surveyed across the whole time series. And so if climate matching was increasing, species were becoming more responsive to climate, and so their distributions and abundances are more tightly related to climate. The trend could be constant, so there's no change. Or if there was a negative relationship, it means that these species are becoming more decoupled from climate. So their distributions are kind of, being less matched to climate over time. And so, yeah, so this was the model. We just modeled climate matching as a function of year, and we did it for each species. So each species had its own trend in time, and we also controlled for the phylogeny. In general, we saw a general trend, so the population level effect was negative. So this means that species are becoming more decoupled from climate over time as climate changes. And this was so independently of the species model, of the species climate model behind it. So independently of the model I used for modeling the species distributions, the trends was always the same. So there's a tendency for the distributions and abundancy of these species to become decoupled from climate. This was not related to the rates of temperature change and land cover change within the species ranges. So it's not because in the places where I live, climate or land use change is changing at higher rates that I'm having more difficulty to track my preferred climate. But we did find some relationships with species traits. So we did find a positive relationship with body mass, and again, with habitat specialization. So the more specialized were species in their habitats, the higher the negative trends, the higher the climatic decoupling we were observing. And finally, I checked whether the demographic trends of these species were associated to these trends in climate matching. And so if you think that populations might be declining or increasing, and climate could be decoupling or otherwise, or the species distribution could be more decoupled or more coupled to climate. And so I tried to put some mechanistic insights here. So if you see that a trend for climate decoupling and species are declining, this means that there are some kind of threats that is decoupling these species from climate, because they're doing worse than before, and on top of that they are becoming decoupled from their climate. It also can happen that species can be declining, but there's more climate coupling. So for example, if you're seeking for a climate-driven resource that is more scarce through time, or that is decreasing through time, so the population could be declining because of that. Or otherwise, climate-depending niche tracking could be the case if there's more climatic coupling and populations are doing well, or it could be decoupling and populations increasing because niches are kind of doing well because their trophic resource not associated to climate is increasing. Sorry. And so what I saw was a positive relationship between the trends in climate matching and the trends in abundance and occupancy. So this was generally positively correlated, but there were instances for every possible association between the abundance trends and climate matching. So for example, the grasshopper sparrow, which is an habitats specialist, it shows declining populations and progressive climatic decoupling through time, probably because it's a grassland species seeking for habitats that are probably decreasing more and more due to land use changes and land cover changes. And this was confirmed by external estimates. So this is from the Partners in Flight, which are data not tightly connected to the IUCN, but they also evaluate and have updated records of the conservation status of species. And so we also saw clearly this negative relationship. So the more threatened species are, or the more intense or the steeper the declines, the lower the trends, so the more negative trends in climate matching. So the more decoupled they are becoming from climate. And so, conclusions from these last parts. There's a progressive climatic decoupling independently of the rates of global change within the species ranges. and habitat specialists and species with deteriorating conservation status show stronger climatic decoupling than others. And so sorry, I'm taking a bit longer than. Just to finish, climate matching can vary among populations and species as well as through time, and this has implications for the species distribution models and climate envelope models. If species are becoming decoupled from climate, maybe it's not a good idea to use climate envelope models for predicting their future distributions. Habitat specialization and demography are major correlates of climate matching and its temporal trends. There's a general trend for increasing climatic decoupling across North America. And species that are more affected by global change and have deteriorating conservation status show steeper climatic decoupling trends. And I will skip it was kind of a future thing at EBD, but I will skip it. So yeah, thanks a lot for hearing.
Great, fantastic, really interesting. So we have time for questions.
I do have one.
Sure.
So, when the people in the online chat warms up, so one thing that interested me a lot is that you used in the traits that you evaluated, there were thermal tolerance traits. So I was expecting somehow thermal tolerance, but I only saw body size.
Yeah.
How is that body size could translate into thermal tolerance?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's really difficult to interpret body size relationships because, body size is controlling or is associated to so many physiological and other aspects of individuals and populations and species that is really difficult. And so, yeah, I don't know. So body size, it's not only about, the physiological tolerance and thermal regulatory capacity. It's also associated to dispersal limitations, to any other kinds of responses. So this one is really tricky and difficult to interpret. And yeah, we didn't want to go crazy with so much traits as well because, there's so many traits and aspects of a bird that you can use to, inspect these relationships that, yeah.
Okay, it's just that in the end, it looked to me like the two winning traits was demography and habitat type, right?
Yeah.
Will be somehow interpreted as more important than thermal tolerance traits, which
Yeah.
seems to me like fundamental to establish where a species can be or not, right?
Yeah, so there's this study that tells that the body size and the thermal regulatory capacity of birds is not tightly associated to climate because of the insulative capacity of feathers.
Mm-hmm.
And so in birds that might be a different story. So again, it's difficult to know what is behind body size, but yeah, habitat specialization is easier to interpret, for example.
Okay, thank you.
Was there any questions in the chat?
No more questions. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Duarte, for the talk. A quick question. So, if habitat specialization has some effect in the matching of the species to the habitat, did that happen at a specific types of habitat? I mean, so for like montane forests or things like that are presumably being hit the hardest through climate change. Are also those specialists of those habitats the ones that are showing more the trend, or is it a general regardless of the type of habitat?
So the relationship is general, but it's true that we saw specifically that in open habitats, so species that prefer open habitats and are kind of specialized on those habitats are the ones that are showing the highest climatic decoupling trend. So they are less well matched to climate than the others. And there might be various explanations for that, but I think the most plausible one is that open habitats are the ones that are being more affected by global change, for example, land use change in North America. And so if you prefer these kinds of habitats, you can imagine that it's being harsher for these species to seek for their optimal climatic space if they don't have habitat where to go and fill in their climatic niche. So yeah. I didn't check for the interaction, but from a visual and explorative analysis, it seems that this is the case.
Okay. Does anybody have any other question, please?
In the second paper, the training and the testing places were not randomly placed. So it seems that your test places are in clumps. Why you did that?
That's a good question. That's because, so it's a spatial blocking cross-validation, and that's useful because to avoid spatial autocorrelation. If you kind of randomly choose your testing sites, because these are intermingled with the training sites, you cannot really disentangle the spatial autocorrelation from the signal of the model. So by doing this spatial blocking and having kind of discrete spatial blocks, you can really account for spatial autocorrelation in your predictive ability or on model predictions. So there's a paper by Roberts in 2017 explaining this spatial block cross-validation and how to avoid spatial autocorrelation in your.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. Very cool. I was interested in the diet analysis you did.
Sorry again?
The diet.
Diet.
So because you made a PCA, no, or something like
yeah.
that. And so, what were you using for that? The qualitative items, or?
Yeah. So this is so this data was taken from Whitman. There's a database where they have all the diet classifications, invertebrates, plants, seed-based, omnivore, various categories. And then you can reduce all these using these multivariate statistics, doing a PCOA first. So you do first transform this into a distance matrix using a Gower distance matrix, and then you do a PCOA on this. And so you can reduce all these, diets axes to just two PCA axes that explain, I think it explained 70% or so of the diet. And so the first PCA axis was mainly determined by plant-based diet at one extreme and invertebrate insect-based diet on the other extreme.
Yeah.
So it's just a convenient way of reducing all this dimensionality to a...
Yeah. I was surprised that was not very well related with the climate matching, because we know that birds, they are matching resources. And it was strange that, and normally resources are matching climate, so I was expecting a stronger correlation, but the correlation was very weak.
Yeah, it was very weak, and yeah, it's really hard to interpret. Actually, we included diets because of a suggestion by a reviewer, and it told precisely that diet is really important, so you should, and it kind of connects to climate well, so you should include it.
Maybe
so we include it, and we see a certain trend for insectivorous species to have more climate matching than granivorous species, but it's not really strong, and
Yeah.
it's difficult to interpret.
Maybe any
Yeah.
kind of diet specialization, like in the same way you are using habitat specialization.
Yeah.
Because I from my hypothesis will be that more diet-specific animals will be more dependent on that resource and more tracking climate, more matching climate than more generalist species. So maybe instead of using this PCA, any kind of qualitative approach, like generalist diet or specialized. But I mean, this is for the
ecological specialization more generally than just habitat specialization.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that's usually referred as to niche breadth, right? And yeah, but it's tricky to calculate because there's so many dimensions that. Yeah, and
it's
so
not easy.
I was telling before, you could go crazy with all the things you have to explore, and so we kind of try to reduce it to a set of traits that was more or less linked to interpretable ecological theory, you know.
Okay. I see.
But yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your talk. Very interesting, Duarte. I have a question. Do you know if other animal groups are responding to climate matching the same way, based on the same traits?
You mean other than birds?
Mammals, reptiles.
Yeah, I don't know.
The same answer to
That's a good question. It would be cool to do this with other taxa. The thing is that it's really difficult to have data to do this in a proper way, or at least in a way that the models don't go crazy and do some, you know, consistent measuring of your index of climate matching.
For instance, mammals can respond, body size can be very significant.
Mammals could be a good one to do this as well.
Yeah. Or reptile.
But yeah.
Temperature can be.
Yeah, for sure. It would be interesting, but yeah, I don't know. So
Okay.
But for sure, it's a future plan, for sure.
Okay, thank you.
To expand this analysis.
Duarte, thank you for your talk, very interesting. I was wondering, your bird data set, was it from the breeding season?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I didn't say that. It's just breeding, yeah.
How do you think that the wintering season might be, because we know that, I mean, they might depend on different things, on the different season, and where they go. Do you think that the wintering season climate changes might be affecting in a different way than the breeding data?
It could. We actually were asked by another reviewer about that, and it could be that they have different climatic niches during winter also, for example, and because of this, you know, wide climatic niche breadth, then species could be more or less flexible in their breeding distributions and stuff like this. So that could be impacting the analysis as well. We did separate migratory species from non-migratory species and did the models independently for one group and the other. And the results are quite consistent. So the same traits appear to be, or to underlie both non-migratory and migratory species, if that's of some help. Yeah. But
Thanks.
It's true that there's some variation in there that we did not account for that might be explaining, you know, unexplained variation in our analysis, for sure. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Duarte. So we are out of time, but we have one last question that I'm going to allow, because I have been told that it was too hard with the time limit. So just for one last option one last question from the chat from Elena Angulo. She was wondering, she was also not expecting, she wasn't expecting so low climate matching for more threatened species.
For more, sorry, again?
She says, I was expecting less climate matching as species are more threatened.
Specialists, yeah.
Yeah, more threatened. The more threatened species will be more matching. That's what she expected.
Okay, yeah.
And then she was wondering whether this could be related to the sample size in each conservation category.
Yeah. It could be related to sample size in the first study, so in the GEB, the second study, where it's true that I used the IUCN categories for that, and it's true that for the vulnerable species it was only 5 species or so. But on the other one, the third one with the temporal trends, I did it with another classification, and there it was a more continuous classification, different threat levels. And there, the sample size did not differ that much, or at least I had decent sample sizes in each category. But the trend was really clear that the more threatened species were, the more decoupled they were becoming from climates.
Thank you. Thank you very much,
It's true that you could expect that more vulnerable species could be the ones with higher climate matching if you think that climate change is the main driver of the declining. But it was not the case. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much. We're finishing now. And thank you, everybody who is watching. See you next week. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.